We are in chapter 6 of the book of Esther. This is a fascinating little story if you're familiar with it. This one of two books in the Old Testament that never mentions the name of God. This is the point of the book that has an incredible ironic twist. Do you know the word irony? This is a great word. We are suspicious that Shakespeare was very familiar with the book of Esther. Literary historians have said that they think that this is where many of the characters and situations of irony that he uses in his plays, it often seems to be based on the events of the book of Esther. My son has a t-shirt, irony, the opposite of wrinkly. I don't know if you understand the word irony, but that is not what irony is, just to clarify for you. He has another shirt that is ironic. If you don't know the word irony, it's a great word. His church says National Spelling Champion. In case you haven't read that wrong. Okay, in case you're not sure what irony is, that is an example of irony. What the words say are the opposite of what the message that they're conveying. If you're the National Spelling Champion, how come it's spelled wrong on your shirt? There's irony there. Says one thing, but the message it gives you is the opposite. Here's a dictionary definition. It's a figure of speech in which words are used in such a way that their intended meaning is different from the actual meaning of the words. It's typically used in literature for humorous or emphatic effects. It's not hard to find irony. I personally find irony extremely entertaining. I seem to look for it everywhere I go. These are not pictures I'm going to show you that are from that I have found, but I love irony. Here's one. Don't read this billboard while driving. If you don't understand how ironic that is, it says on the bottom, distraction kills. I once saw a t-shirt that says, do not read this t-shirt. That is ironic. How do you do that? I just read that not to read that. It's okay, I think that's funny. Maybe I'm the only one. Do not read this billboard. Can you imagine driving on, what's that say, honey? I don't know, pull over. What's those tiny words? It says distraction kills. I like this one. Drive as if your kids live here. Now, can you imagine if the driver wasn't driving as if the kids live there? Woo, that's interesting. Here's my favorite ironic picture. I Googled for this and thought this was the best one. This is called home delivery, if ever there was. The Republican where the news hits home. Yeah, there's some irony. I'll tell you, talk about hitting home. I mean, over the fence, into the bush, through the porch. That's called home delivery right there. Here is a really good one, too. If it takes you a while to digest this, you're the best teacher ever. You get for this plaque for your teacher. Yeah? Is it registered? If you're the best teacher ever, then the word your would be spelled Y-O-U''R-E. You are the best teacher ever. This is grammatically incorrect. If you're the best teacher, you would at least teach me how to spell. The irony. This is what irony is, and this is the great crux of this book. It comes to a great twist. It's not added. There is just on the level, you have to smile at this. There's humor in this. It's not a belly laugh humor. It's a ha humor. And this is one of the great moments in all of the Bible where the tables turn. The point where the villain finally gets what he doesn't expect. And the innocent victim gets what he doesn't expect. And you think the story's going this way. And he thinks the story's going that way. And the tables turn. Oh, it's so ironic. Esther 6. We'll look at the entire chapter, verses 1 to 14. I've mentioned to you already that the book of Esther does not mention the name of God. That is for there on purpose. That is left out on purpose because the author wants us to see that God is working in and through the subtle, ordinary events of what is taking place in this part of history. I mentioned to you that this book is full of the providence of God because you can't read this book without knowing that. And I realize that I'm repeating myself, that I'm saying the same thing over again, that I'm repeating myself and I'm getting repetitious, but I need you to understand that because this is the theme of the book. You can't help but come back to this. What is the providence of God? It is God present and working through all that comes to pass in the world and directs all things to their desired end for which they were created. In other words, God works through the ordinary means of ordinary people, through their ordinary lives, with ordinary decisions, without the means of the miraculous. God is an almighty, all-powerful God. We often think of God in those big terms, and we should. But sometimes we don't think of God that he's so big that he doesn't actually need to use a miracle. He is so great that he doesn't actually need to step in and do something profound to get his ends that he desires. He is so great and so profound and so awesome that he actually uses the ordinary decisions that you make to accomplish his ends. He doesn't need to step in all the time. And we see this as the hand of God in the ordinary, in the mundane, in the routine. Sometimes we say, oh, God just seems so far away. That's impossible. He seems that to you, but we don't base our theology on our feelings. We base it on truth. And the truth is that God is in and through and about all that happens. Nothing can escape his attention. Every decision you make, you are responsible for. But at the end of the day, God is using your decisions to accomplish his purposes. How this works is part of the inscrutable mystery of God. But this is what the book of Esther is about. Here's an example of those human decisions. Verse 21 of chapter 2. You remember this as we look back. I told you to remember this part because we have to come back to it. I know you wouldn't have remembered it, so now we're reading it again. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, I'm sorry, I have to pause here. As I was working through this week, I thought, Bigthan, if you had the name Bigthan and you were a woman, wouldn't you change your name? This has got to be, no woman wants the word big in her name. Do you know what I'm saying? Okay, I'm sorry, is there a little thin and a small thin, a medium thin? It's just a weird word. Okay, I'm sorry. Distract myself. Yeah, now you're like, why did I come to church today? In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Their intention was not to fulfill the mysterious purposes of God. Their intention was to set out to kill the king. They made their own decisions, and they're responsible for their own decisions. Little did they know that their decisions ultimately became worked out and worked through to fulfill the purposes of God. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. He told it to Queen Esther. Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This little event, two people choosing to do something of their own free will and being responsible for that by ultimately hanging in the gallows, ultimately led to the edict that all of the Jews would be ultimately eradicated. God uses even the simple affairs of our human decisions. So chapter 6, verse 1, first sentence. On that night, the king could not sleep. On what night? This is the night, if you remember, we've been a couple weeks since we've been in this book. The end of chapter 5, two things happen. Haman and the king are invited to a banquet, and that very night after the banquet that Queen Esther sits them down and is going to tell them the news and says, but wait, I'll tell you next time we meet. They gather for that banquet. On that night, the king couldn't sleep. On that night, after Haman has gone home and gathered his friends around and bragged to all of his family what a great person he is, how awesome he must be, that he just had dinner with the king and queen, he is cool. He had to tell everybody about it. On that night, just ordinary circumstances are taking place. If you look at this book, you would just about yawn at how ordinary everything is that is happening. It's nothing profound. There's no finger of God. It's just people living their lives, doing their thing. And by it happens to be that on a certain night, the king couldn't sleep. Is this ordinary? Is this a routine? Does he always have insomnia? We don't know. But we do know it is recorded that it seems ordinary to you, to me. Do you have trouble sleeping sometimes? Do you wake up at 3 in the morning and now you're like, well, let's see what happens tonight? Yeah. Don't you know that club? Yeah, well, if you don't know that club, it's because you haven't had kids yet. That's what happened to me. As soon as we had children, This is a true story. I have never slept straight through the night again. Once children came into my life, changed my clock, messed me up. Okay, you don't need my details, but I'm just saying, you know the deal? Is this ordinary for him? Perhaps it's ordinary. But this is the night he couldn't sleep. And it happens to be the day after they've had the meal. Haman has bragged about how great he is. And if you remember, his wife, and we'll read that text in a minute, his wife has told him that if you really are upset about Mordecai, why don't you just show how great you are and have the king have him hang on the gallows? So Haman is now waking up on the same night that the king can't sleep. Haman is bursting at his seams to get out of bed to run and to talk to the king about this great idea. We're going to get rid of this Mordecai. And he is also waking up early on the very same night there's going to be an intersection of human circumstance. Here it is, verse 14. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully to the king, with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman. He had the gallows made. Go and tell him in the morning. Get up first thing and run to the king. On that night, chapter 6, verse 1. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the chronicles, that were read before the king. Why is he doing this? Because he can't sleep. Do you have a book on your nightstand? What do you do when you sleep? Should I tell you tales? What happens in my room when we can't sleep? The room gets super bright, annoyingly bright, because my wife is reading her iPad. And I just happen to know if I peep an eye open, somebody's not sleeping because the room is as bright as day. And then we begin to have a discussion on which side of the bed you should lie on and how we should roll and where you should be and why can't you get under the blankets. Bright as day! Yeah, it's our daily discussion. Sorry, was that too much information? Yeah, I might get us sleeping in a separate bed tonight, I think. Yeah. So what do you do when you can't sleep? Well, the king knew what he needed to do. It was read. It wasn't Peter Pan, it wasn't Moby Dick, clearly. He found the most boring thing you could think of, and he happened to pick up the book of the memorials, the chronicle, that memorialized all the deeds of the king. So he happened to choose to read. Now on the surface, that's just an ordinary decision. It seems like everybody would do that. Exactly. Why wouldn't God use what everybody does? But you know, this king didn't have to do that. You know, he could have made warm milk he's a king. Pardon me for saying this. He could have invited anybody from his harem to come and entertain him. He could have done anything he wanted. He was a king, but he chose of his own free will to do the ordinary thing and choose a book. And he happens to choose, of all the things he could choose to read, he happens to choose the book that contained the events of Mordecai stopping the assassination of the king. Of all the things he could read. And it was found, written, how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. They actually read the very portion that explained what had happened. Just ordinary events. It just happened to be that way. Now there's a Jewish legend, which is not true, if I can say politely, but just to give you some sense of it, that these events are so ordinary that somewhere Jewish lore has decided that it needs to be embellished a little bit. I mean, we got to make this book a little more interesting. It's just so routine. It's just ordinary events. So what they do at this point is they explain that when the book was brought in, that the eunuch who opened the book opened it at exactly the page where this portion was to be read, but decided, I'm not reading that page, and flipped a few pages more to the right, and then began to read, and just then a wind blew through the window and blew the pages back to the place where this record was written down that Mordecai had stopped the assassination of the king. Now, why does that legend exist? Because we can't read the book and think, it can't be this boring. There's got to be the hand of God somewhere in this. This is the inscrutable mystery of the providence of God. Please understand that your life is lived in the very presence of God. That everything you do and choose to do is done with the very knowledge of God. And in doing what you do, somehow He is working in and through the very mundane, routine, ordinary situation of your life. This is the inscrutable mystery of the providence of God. The king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done to him." Well, that's interesting. So the king decides to respond. Now, this is not extraordinary by any stretch, because this is exactly what a Persian king would do. We have records of things that the Persian kings have done. I didn't look it up enough to put it in here because time was challenging this week, needless to say. But anyways, it's actually very fascinating if you're interested in the history of that. Things that people received, lands, money, taxes from certain people groups that they had received as a result of doing something great for the king. If you bolstered the nation, it was almost incumbent upon the king to respond to you in some dramatic and significant way. This is one of the reasons that Haman is put in the position that he is in. We're not sure what he did, but obviously he's done something, and the king wanted to respond. The king now wants to respond, as he should, rather than say, "Well, I'm kind of embarrassed. We could have let this go because nobody's noticed and nobody said anything." The king said, "Who's in the court?" Now, right in the middle, it just so happens, right at the moment when he's reading about this event, they hear a little shuffle of sandals out in the court, and there's a little motion and a little bit of noise that catches the king's attention. And the king decides to pay attention to who is in the court. Now, Haman had just entered the court. He probably skipped breakfast. He probably went skipping out down the pathway, could hardly wait to get there. I mean, this is still morning. I mean, this is the wee hours of the morning where the king is trying to sleep. Haman can hardly sleep. He can hardly wait to get there. And it so happens they both have opposite issues, and they come and intersect right at this moment. What are the chances? Now, Haman had just entered the court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The ordinary events. The king could have ignored. He's in the middle of discussing about the situation that he just read. He could have dealt with this. Let's discuss this. Let's figure this out. But no, he's distracted, and he goes with that. Oh, who's here? And you know, and I know, that he doesn't have to allow this man to come into his presence. But they intersect right at this exact timing. Verse 5. The king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Go and kill him." No, he doesn't. Is the king in authority to allow people into his presence? Yes, he is. What is the only means by which someone can come into the king's presence? If the king gives him permission. And it just so happens that the king, in that moment, while he's doing this and dealing with that, he allows permission for Haman to come in. Well, how ordinary. But what if he didn't? So Haman came in. The king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" I'm going to read that again and see if you catch anything important here. So Haman came in and said to the king, and the king said to him, "And what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" So far in the reading and in the king's discussion, go back and look at the text. Mordecai's name is used. And it never comes across the lips of the king to say what should be done for Mordecai the Jew. He leaves his name out. Well, that is super convenient. Because if he had used Mordecai's name, well, you know what Haman would have said. "Funny thing. That's exactly why I'm here this morning. I'll tell you what we should do with him." But no. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? So Haman came in. And the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? I can think of nobody. Wow, this is like a Christmas present wrapped inside of a birthday present, wrapped inside of a Hanukkah gift. I mean, what is this? Who would the king like to honor? Oh, his wheels are turning now. This is the epitome of the arrogance of a man who has now understood the situation through his own set of glasses. Oh, you can feel the drum roll rolling in the background. You can feel the irony ratcheting up. You know what's going to happen, and aren't you just loving it? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. This seems strange to you and me, perhaps. I think it's kind of weird. But you know, you got to remember that Haman is already second in command. Haman already has, if I can use the word, bookalooks of riches. I mean, he has everything he needs. He has all the power, all the wealth, all the lands. What more is this man supposed to ask for? He thinks he's asking this for himself. Mordecai, in my opinion, gets the raw end of the deal. He gets like whatever this takes, a few hours of accolades, but Haman is doing this for himself. He thinks it's for him, and so he's coming up, he's scheming up something that he would love. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus to the man whom the king delights to honor. Awesome. Dramatic pause. We got to just let that hang there for a minute. Aren't you just waiting to see what happens? Well, we know what happens. Now, this might seem like a strange thing. It's used clothing, used crown, used horse. This would be the means of Haman saying, look how close I am to the king. That the king himself has let me go into his own closet and pick out whatever I want to wear that the king used to wear. I am riding on the king's horse. We are like this, more like this, but like this. We're best buds. Look what the king thinks of me. Verse 10, so awesome. And the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing out that you have mentioned. Oh, don't you love the ironic twist of a moment? Wouldn't you love to have been there to see Haman's face, trying to figure out how could this possibly be the case? His jaw hit the floor. What happened in this moment? He knows he has to do it. It's an edict from the king. Wouldn't you have loved to see the look on this man's face? And you notice the text. It's very plain that we make sure it's not just Mordecai. Let's rub some vinegar into the paper cut. It's Mordecai the Jew. I hate those Jews, Haman's saying. And I have to go and do this to him? So Haman took the robes and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Wouldn't you like to have been there on the back of that horse? I mean, just what was Mordecai thinking? Was he, saying, what was that, Haman? I like how you shouted that, Haman. It wasn't quite loud enough. Do that again. Yeah, no, this is a little too quickly, Haman. Let's just take our time through the city square. Hold on. Let's stop here by the fountain for a while. Shout that thing again. No, do it again. Do it louder. Oh, wouldn't you have loved to have seen this? We don't know what happened, but that's the way it would have played out in my selfish mind. Oh, how ironic. And God uses the ordinary turn of events through human decisions to turn the tables. This great intersection of just the mundane, routine, everyday, and yet this is exactly what God does to make sure that God's people remain God's people. Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. That is the ironic tables turned. It was Mordecai who was supposed to be mourning this day. It was Mordecai who would not be going back to his job. It was Mordecai who was supposed to be embarrassed in public and die. It is now Haman who is embarrassed, who is mourning, who is running back with his head down. It is now Haman who has been humiliated. And the tables have completely turned right out of the blue. Nobody saw it coming. How could this be? Except that there's a hand, a mysterious, silent hand of God in and through all the routine of situations that you could never put together yourself. God's timing is always perfect. I remember some years ago, I just put this picture here to jog my memory to tell you this little story. This is not a picture of the event, but I was in a fender bender. I wasn't driving, I was a passenger. I got picked up every day. This is the days of our going to Bible school. A gentleman lived close to us who was in school with us. Him and his wife had a little apartment. Things were tight for them because he was in school, students, they were newly married, trying to pay their rent, trying to get on, and he had this little beater of a car, and he would pick us up every day in his Honda Civic. Not to suggest that Honda Civics are beaters, but this one had lived a good life, and it was coming to the end of its days, and we were always wondering how long it would last. But he would rattle up to our driveway, and he would take us, Robin and I, to school. This day it happened to be just me, and chatting away, doing our thing, and we're stopping at a red light. I can still picture it because it was just like yesterday to me. I looked over on my right side just as the moment, and I saw this big wide car. You know, I'm dating myself now, but you know those cars that are big enough to put a canoe lengthwise in the back seat? It's one of those, and this guy comes out of his driveway or whatever he was doing, and just straight on, I looked over to my side, and big, as wide as can be, well, he was completely embarrassed, and being that this was a Honda Civic, he literally dented the car from the front bumper through the door all the way to the back bumper. Entire length of the car. The door worked, the windows still cranked. Of course, it wasn't power windows. Everything was fine, except it now had this big dent in it. So exchange insurance, blah, 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 blah. Everything hurt. I bumped my head. Nobody cared. I've told everybody. I bumped my head. They were like, oh, how's the car? I bumped my head. Yeah, but is there any damage to the car? I could be bleeding. You don't care about my head. So the insurance company responded to Bob, that was his name, told him that his car was a write-off, given the age of the vehicle, that the damage that was done was not worth repairing, you know the deal, because the car is worth about $12, and so it's going to take a little more than that to fix. So we're going to settle with you. We're just going to give you the book value of your vehicle. In the midst of all this, we're waiting for that check to arrive, and Bob's waiting to find out what he gets and all the rest, and we're still driving the car. And day by day, because it was still functional, Bob didn't have the money to get another one. Everything worked. Well, he's got a big dent in it. What can he do? It's more of a beater now than it ever was. And every time we'd pass that spot, because we went the same way, we'd say, you know, how strange was it that we met that guy right here, right then? I mean, we started to just get philosophical. Imagine if it had been 5 seconds later when we were leaving my house. Imagine if, and we were just throwing stuff out, imagine if you had overslept by 1 minute. Imagine if I had another piece of toast for breakfast. Imagine if we had just been a little quicker, if I didn't eat breakfast, whatever. All of that, it was just perfect symmetry that this car hit us because you happened to show up a minute late, Bob. It's clearly your fault, not mine. We just always bantered that around. Well, you know, interestingly enough, the check came to pay for his vehicle, and he got 800 and something. I don't remember the details and the pennies. Bob came to me, and he's like, I got my check. He's got these big eyes. You're not going to believe this. It's 800, and I don't remember the numbers. I just remember it started with an 8. 800 and 500, you know, 800 to $25.62, whatever it was. Wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's good. You know, Bob says, you don't understand. I owe the school for my tuition. I haven't been able to pay my bills. And Mim and I have been praying that God would supply our money to pay for our bills. You're not going to believe how much money I owe the school for my tuition. $825 and some pennies. Was off by like 12 cents. Bob said, I'll pay the 12 cents. We could never quite work out if really, could it be that that's how God provided by bashing up his car? Does that make sense? I don't know. But Bob actually didn't care about his car being bashed up. It was a junker. And he had no qualms about driving around with a junker. It was already embarrassing to drive. And here he is now with exactly the money. And we laughed and laughed at how crazy that was. That the perfect timing, that something bad was the very means of you not being in debt and being able to pay your bills. The stress that was lifted off of them, the timing, in a stupid moment of ordinary human circumstances. How does God work? Inscrutably, mysteriously, through the ordinary decisions and happenstance of our lives. Haman, verse 13, told Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. If you remember, this is coincide with the opposite side when he called all his friends to tell him how great he was. Now he's telling them how embarrassed he was. He tells his friends everything that happened to him. His wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before you, whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. If he's a Jew and God is on his side, guess which way this is going to go, Haman? This is not going to end well. That is exactly what God says in Psalm 2. All those who rail against him, he just laughs. Who are you to think you can go against me? And while they were talking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried him to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Oh, the drama. We'll pick that up next week. Let me just give you something to think about as we consider, if we can even look into the mind of Haman, surmising from the text we were reading. Haman, as he worked through this situation and he was standing before the king, Haman didn't realize that he was going up against Mordecai the Jew, which implied Mordecai, a person whose life was under the authority of God. He completely disregarded that God had anything to do with this man. He thought that he was the second greatest in the kingdom of all of Persia. He thought that the edict that he had created would most certainly eradicate the Jews. He thought that Mordecai was going to die on the day that he woke up and ran into the king. He thought that he had a plan and he was in charge. This is the typical arrogant human condition that rails against the God who is. I am the second greatest in my kingdom. Oh, sure, I might acknowledge that God exists. Some people don't. I might acknowledge that he's there, but at the end of the day, I am really the one who's running my life. I am really the one who's in charge of my life. I am really the one who's making my decisions for me. I know what's best for me. I create my own moral laws. I write my own edicts. I decide how I'm going to live. Oh, I know God says this, 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 and this, but you don't understand. I had to tell that lie. I can explain why I tell lies. It's important that I do that. It maintains my reputation. I know that God says this, but I write my own rules. I live by my own scheme. I know my own edicts. I believe that Mordecai, that the bad people in my life, I know justice. They need to move out of my way. I know that they should die, as it were. I think they should be punished by God. All those bad people out there, they deserve to be punished by God. All those people who've done this and that and this and that. Not me. I write my own edicts. I write my own laws, and I'm in charge, but all those other people should die. I've got this. I see what real justice is. I am in charge of my life. I'm in control of my destiny. How foolish are you? Do you not know the God who is? Do you not know that your life is diametrically opposed to the God who has authority over you? You're not in charge of your life. He's in charge of your life. You need to submit your life to him. You need to bow the knee of his authority. You need to submit and surrender your life to his care. You need to give up your plans and your rules and your moral schemes. You need to submit to the God who is. Otherwise, you are the one who's in trouble. You are the one who's going to hang, as it were. You are the ones who are going to find the tables turned. You are the one who thinks you're in charge, and the ironic day is going to come when you realize the God you ignored has actually been the God who's in charge of this universe the entire time. And you thought you were the king of the world. You're the king of your world. Surprisingly enough, it's not so. The God who is the God who governs your life. And even if you do not submit to him today, one day you will bow the knee and acknowledge that he is the Lord. He is the King. I call on you this morning, if you don't know Christ as the one who's rescued you and made you right with eternal God. He is the only means by which you can come to know peace with God, with whom you are already an enemy. I'll just put a bow on this morning as we try to find something practical in this challenging narrative. Obviously, I've said this, and hopefully this is a takeaway for us to just begin to consider our own lives. God's timing is always perfect. That even includes those timing when things go bad, when we wait longer than we think we should wait, that the house that we want to sell just won't sell, that the thing that we're looking for is just not happening. Why is it going this way? How come God is being so silent? Why is he not doing something? All I know is God's timing is always perfect. That's the God who is, and that's what we see in Scripture over and over again, and he's doing what he does because God knows what is best. God works in the ordinary, in the mundane, in the genuine, boring parts of life. Can you believe that? That's how great God is. He doesn't need a miracle to accomplish his purposes. He just uses the routine of us to accomplish his ends. That even includes you coming to church today. It includes me fumbling through trying to put a message together this week. All the routine and ordinary. This is God right now working in our lives. His plan can ultimately never be unraveled, never be thwarted, never be changed. How that works, the inscrutable mystery of the providence of God. We don't understand, but we know that the end game is for his glory and his purposes, and they will be fulfilled. And you are in the midst of the story, being used for his glory. Get with the program. Submit to him. Be obedient to him. And join him in the great unfolding of his plan for human history. This is the book of Esther.